the 15th of March, 1939. 6 months after the annexation of the Sudetenland, Nazi Germany, in flagrant violation of the Munich Agreement, invades and occupies the Czech provinces of Bohemia and Moravia. Adolf Hitler himself arrives in Prague, and on the 16th of March, by a proclamation from Prague Castle, establishes the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. Konstantin von Neurath, the former foreign minister of Nazi Germany, becomes its Reich protector. But because the Führer feels that his rule is too lenient and his soft approach to the Czechs has promoted anti-German sentiment and encouraged anti-German resistance via strikes and sabotage, in September 1941 he dismisses von Neurath and appoints Reinhard Heydrich as new acting Reich protector. Heydrich's Secretary of State and Chief of Police in the Protectorate is a man with whom the Nazi architect of the Holocaust launches a reign of terror, arresting and killing opponents and ramping up the deportation of Jews to concentration camps. After Heydrich's assassination in May 1942, this man will conduct brutal reprisals against the Czechs, killing over 1,300 men, women, and children. His name is Karl Hermann Frank. Karl Hermann Frank was born on the 24th of January 1898 in Karlsbad, today's Czech Karlovy Vary, then part of Austria-Hungary. His father Heinrich was an elementary school teacher and ardent German nationalist who brought up his son steeped in the German nationalist movement. When Karl was 9 or 10 years old, he was hit right in the eye by a rock while playing with other children. When the First World War began, on the 28th of July 1914, Frank was 16 years old. He attempted to enlist in the Austro-Hungarian army, but was rejected due to the blindness in his right eye caused by the aforementioned injury. In 1918, even though the doctors tried to fix his eye for a long time, they eventually had to take it out and replace it with a glass one. In October 1918, the Czechoslovak National Council in Prague proclaimed the independence of Czechoslovakia. 50% of the Czechoslovak population consisted of Czechs. Germans and Slovaks accounted for 22% and 16% respectively. Karl Hermann Frank was a Sudeten German, which was a name for the ethnic Germans living within Czechoslovakia, and he became an extreme advocate of the incorporation of the Sudetenland, where he lived, into Germany. In 1919, he joined the proto-fascist party of Germans in Czechoslovakia, named the German National Socialist Workers' Party. 6 years later, in 1925, Frank opened a bookstore which specialized in National Socialist literature. From 1933, when Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party came into power, the Nazi regime began not only to restrict the civil and human rights of the Jews, establishing the first concentration camps, but it also demanded the return of the Sudetenland to the German Reich. When over 3 days between the 11th and 13th of March 1938, Adolf Hitler annexed the federal state of Austria into the German Reich, the failure of the British and French to take action against him for violating the Versailles Treaty emboldened him toward further aggression. In late summer 1938, Hitler threatened to unleash a European war unless the Sudetenland was ceded to Germany. This part of Czechoslovakia also contained the Czechoslovak army's defensive positions in the event of a war with Germany. The leaders of Britain, France, Italy and Germany held a conference in Munich between the 29th and 30th of September 1938. In what became known as the Munich Agreement, they agreed to the German annexation of the Sudetenland in exchange for a pledge of peace from Hitler. The Czechoslovaks were not even invited to this conference and felt they had been betrayed by the British and French governments. However, many Sudeten Germans welcomed the German annexation, and Karl Hermann Frank was one of them. He was appointed Deputy Gauleiter, or regional leader of the Nazi Party of the Sudetenland, and on the 1st of November 1938, he joined the Nazi Party and the SS. On the 15th of March 1939, less than 6 months after the annexation of the Sudetenland, Nazi Germany invaded and occupied the remaining parts of Czechoslovakia, establishing the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, which by contrast to the Sudetenland consisted mostly of ethnic Czechs. Immediately after the Nazis started to occupy the whole country, they passed new anti-Jewish laws, which were designed to exclude more than 118,000 Jews that were living in the Protectorate from society and restrict their livelihood. Their bank accounts were frozen, and they were forbidden to sell companies and real estate, which were confiscated and taken over by the Germans. In all, the Germans seized about $500 million, an equivalent to 11 billion United States dollars today worth of Jewish property, in the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. After the occupation of the Czech lands, Frank was promoted to SS-Gruppenführer, which was a rank equivalent to Major General, and appointed Secretary of State of the Reich Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia under Reich Protector Konstantin von Neurath. At the end of April 1939, Heinrich Himmler, the leader of the SS, also named Frank the Protectorate's higher SS and police leader. In this position, Frank wielded great power in the Protectorate as he controlled the Nazi police apparatus, including the intelligence service, the SD, and the security police, which consisted of the Gestapo and the Kripo, which was a criminal police. The Second World War began on the 1st of September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland. On the 17th of February the following year, Frank divorced his wife, Anna Müller. They had married in January 1921 and had 2 sons. 2 months after his divorce, on the 14th of April 1940, he married Karola Blaszek. His new wife was a doctor who was 15 years his junior. Their marriage produced 3 children, daughters Edda and Holle, and a son, Wolf Dietrich. 2 years after the war began, on the 23rd of September 1941, Hitler relieved Neurath of his active duties and stripped him of his day-to-day powers. The reason was that despite the persecution of Czech Jews and the harsh crackdown of those who turned to acts of resistance, his rule overall was too lenient by Nazi standards. Neurath, who even tried to restrain the excesses of his police chief, Karl Hermann Frank, still remained the Reich Protector on paper, but the real power was held by Reinhard Heydrich, who was named his deputy on the 29th of September 1941. Adolf Hitler gave Heydrich a mandate to enforce policy, fight resistance to the Nazi regime, and keep up production quotas of Czech motors and arms that were extremely important to the German war effort. After Heydrich arrived in Prague, he told his staff, "We will Germanize the Czech vermin," and demanded racial classification of those who could and could not be Germanized. Although the working relationship between Heydrich and Karl Hermann Frank was initially tense, the 2 men, both being ambitious and brutal, became an effective duo in treating the Czechs harshly. In October 1941, just 1 month after Heydrich's arrival, the systematic deportation of Jews from the territory of the Protectorate started, with the transports to the Łódź ghetto, which was located in German-occupied Poland. By the 3rd of November of the same year, 5,000 Jews were deported to the ghetto. Only 277 out of 5,000 Jews deported to the Łódź ghetto survived. In November 1941, Reinhard Heydrich established the Theresienstadt ghetto, which was located in the fortress town of Terezin, in the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. The first transport of Czech Jews arrived in the same month. Heydrich and Frank launched a reign of terror in the Protectorate. According to Heydrich's estimate, between 4,000 and 5,000 people were arrested, and between 400 and 500 were executed by February 1942. On the 27th of May 1942, Reinhard Heydrich was in his convertible Mercedes when he was wounded by the Czechoslovak paratroopers Josef Gabčík and Jan Kubiš. Even though Heydrich had an infection and was in great pain, on the 3rd of June he was able to eat his midday meal sitting up. However, a few hours later, he collapsed, dying the next day. Heydrich's funeral in Berlin was attended by all the high-ranking Nazi officials, including his superior Heinrich Himmler, and Adolf Hitler himself, who spoke at the funeral and promised revenge. The Nazi authorities in the Protectorate were preparing for this revenge from the 27th of May 1942, when Heydrich was mortally wounded. On that day, Karl Hermann Frank proclaimed a state of emergency and placed a curfew in Prague. Anyone who helped the attackers was to be executed, along with their families. A search involving 21,000 men began, and 36,000 houses were checked. By the 4th of June, 157 people had been executed as a result of the reprisals, but the assassins had not been found and no information was forthcoming. On the 9th of June, the day of Heydrich's state funeral in Berlin, Frank reported from Berlin that the Führer had commanded the following concerning any village found to have harbored Heydrich's killers. Execute all men, transport all women to a concentration camp, gather the children suitable for Germanization, then place them with SS families in the Reich and bring the rest of the children up in other ways, burn down the village and level it entirely. One such village became Lidice, which had been named in a love letter found during the first days of the SS and police investigations into the attack on Heydrich. Though there was no real evidence connecting the people of the town with the assassins, the Nazis used even the smallest pretext to take revenge for Heydrich's death, and singled out Lidice as the site of retaliation. Karl Hermann Frank played a key role in the following destruction of the village, and the execution of its citizens, which were conducted on Hitler's direct order on the 9th and 10th of June 1942. To revenge Heydrich's death, Frank ordered the shooting of all the men in Lidice, sending all the women to concentration camps, and placing those children considered worthy of Germanization in the care of SS families. Children not worthy of Germanization were also murdered. On the morning of the 10th of June 1942, Frank was seen personally coming to inspect the destruction of the village, and was said to be satisfied with the results. In total, 340 inhabitants of Lidice were slaughtered, 192 men, 60 women, and 88 children. All the men and boys were shot and buried in one common grave, and children were murdered in gas vans at the Chelmno extermination camp. 4 pregnant women were forced to undergo abortions in the same hospital where Heydrich died. However, this was not the end. 2 weeks after the massacre at Lidice, the small Czech village of Ležáky was destroyed when Gestapo agents found a radio transmitter there that had belonged to an underground team who parachuted in with Kubiš and Gabčík, who had killed Heydrich. All 33 adults, both men and women from the village, were shot, and the children were sent to concentration camps or Aryanized. The death toll resulting from the effort to avenge the death of Heydrich is estimated at over 1,300 people. This count includes relatives of the partisans, their supporters, Czech elite suspected of disloyalty, and random victims like those from Lidice. In June 1943, Frank was promoted to SS-Obergruppenführer, which was a rank equivalent to a lieutenant general. He was also made General of Police in Prague and General of the Waffen-SS, which was the military branch of the SS. In August 1943, Frank was made Minister of State for Bohemia and Moravia and was granted cabinet rank and status, but without the formal title of Reichsminister. The Czechs named their Nazi Minister of State Bloody Dog Frank. In 1944, Frank personally conducted anti-partisan warfare in Moravia aimed at destroying the Jan Žižka partisan brigade, which was the largest partisan unit in the Protectorate. On the 3rd of November, Frank ordered the summary executions of suspected partisans along with those suspected of helping them. The bodies of the executed suspects were to be hanged in public for 48 hours. Despite these executions and deployment of 13,000 soldiers, the Germans were unable to destroy the partisan brigade, which remained active until the end of the war. In April 1945, when Karl Hermann Frank saw that his reign of terror was over, he decided to flee from Prague and surrender to the Americans as he was afraid of being captured by the Russians. On the 9th of May 1945, Frank was arrested by the US Army troops, but his plan did not work out as he was extradited back to Prague, where from March to May 1946 he was tried by the People's Court. Although no attorney wanted to defend him, he did eventually get one. His name was Kamil Ressler, and for defending Frank, he was nicknamed the Devil's Advocate. Despite a definite death penalty outcome, he proceeded to defend Frank honorably and nobly. During the trial, Frank claimed that he did not feel guilty, but co-responsible, because he had just followed the orders he had been given and had represented only a small part of the criminal Nazi regime. He denied personal responsibility for the executions, although he admitted before the tribunal that they could be regarded according to human feelings and human law as murder. His lies, however, did not help him escape justice, and on Tuesday the 21st of May 1946, the People's Court in Prague sentenced Karl Hermann Frank to death by hanging for treason and the massacre of civilians of the Czech villages of Lidice and Ležáky. Jaroslav Drabek, the prosecutor during the Frank trial, later said, "I, who had to watch helplessly as Hitler systematically killed my nation and murdered my dearest friends, gained the power overnight to make those who caused it all pay for their crimes. In Prague, as prosecutor, I brought to the gallows Karl Hermann Frank, Deputy Protector of Bohemia and Moravia, Kurt Daluge, and many other scoundrels, traitors, and murderers." Even though Karl Hermann Frank had never shown mercy to any of the Czech people, he appealed to Czechoslovak President Edvard Beneš for leniency. Frank wrote to Beneš, "I believe that as a victor you will show mercy and grant me life." However, he was wrong. There was no reply to his telegraphed appeal. Frank's execution was held publicly and became a theater of horror. More than 5,000 people, including 7 surviving women from Lidice who sat in the front row, gathered in the Pankratz prison in Prague to witness the execution of the most hated man in the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. When Karl Hermann Frank was hanged on Wednesday the 22nd of May, 1946, he was 48 years old. At 1:37 p.m., he was lifted up to the top of the pole by a sling and then dropped about a meter, the hangman covering Frank's face with his hand. An avowed Nazi until the bitter end, his last words were, "Germany must live, even if we die. Long live the German nation, long live the German spirit." Normally, a condemned man executed in this way hung on the gallows for half an hour. Frank, however, remained hanging on the rope for 15 minutes longer. Karl Hermann Frank was then buried at an anonymous pit at Lidice Cemetery, where the bodies of Jan Kubiš and Josef Gabčík, the assassins of Reinhard Heydrich in 1942, had secretly been buried in a mass grave. Frank's family did not fare any better. His second wife Karola was arrested, taken to the Soviet Union, and sentenced to a 12-year imprisonment. In the end, she spent 10 years in Kazakhstan's Gulag performing forced labor. She was released in 1955 and moved to West Germany, where it took her 4 years to find her 3 children, who had grown up in new families under new names. There were no tears shed for Karl Hermann Frank. Thanks for watching the World History Channel. Be sure to like and subscribe, and click the bell notification icon so you don't miss our next episodes. We thank you, and we'll see you next time on the channel.